Welcome again to Chapter 4 of the Complete Android Developer course, in which we'll be looking at animations, sound, and video. But before we do that, in this first video, we're going to take a few moments to consider layout in a bit more detail. As this is primarily a development course, we focus more on the code than the actual look of our apps. Of course, the look is important as well. So in this video, I'm just going to show you a few tricks to get your apps looking the way you want them. And first is to bring your attention to the constraint layout. In Android Studio 3, this is now the default, whereas in Android Studio 2, it was a relative layout. And we use constraints over here to decide exactly where they're going to display on the screen. So just to clarify, if I get rid of that text view and bring in a button, I can position this centered or near the margins of the screen, but if I just leave it there, it won't actually be centered on the app, as we saw in a couple of the videos in the previous section. So it will jump to 0, 0, i.e. the top left. So if I want to actually center this, I need to add left and right constraints, as well as a top constraint and a bottom constraint to center it in the app. Now, if you're more familiar with relative layout, we can use those instead. So if you look down the widget palette to layouts, and you can see here we have the good old relative layout. So we can drag that in, and that will then exist within our constraint layout, and that just changes the rules slightly of how things are laid out within the relative layout. So if I now bring in a button, wherever I drag it, it will be positioned according to the nearest margins. So if I leave it there, it will be positioned relative to the top left of the screen. Here, it will be positioned relative to the top right, etc. So that's how the default used to work in Android Studio. So if you want to get back to that, you can. Note that you still need to add constraints for the relative layout because it's within the constraint layout. So let's position our button near the top left. Somewhere like that. And now I'm going to show you the text tab at the bottom there. You may have noticed that and been wondering what it is. Well, the text tab uses XML to describe our layout. So if you come from web development, you might think of this a bit like an HTML document describing the layout of a web page. And if you prefer working with text or code rather than dragging and dropping, you might be more comfortable creating your layout using this XML. And it does have advantages. For example, if I want to have a button that has exactly the same properties as this button that already exists, rather than creating it afresh and adding all the properties, I can just copy and paste the code for that button and it will appear. Now you might not be able to see it there. That's because it's positioned relative to the relative layout, i.e. the parent, and it's exactly the same number of pixels from the top as the original button was. So you'd need to add, for example, a greater margin at the top to move it down. Note that when you do use copy and paste, you'll get two items with the same ID, which will cause a problem. So you'll need to change the ID of one of them, for example, to button 2 and button 3. Now, just to show you how these two relate, i.e. the design and the text view, if, for example, I wanted my button to be positioned relative to the previous button rather than to the relative layout, I can drag it around and you can see that up arrow now points to the button above. So this button is now positioned relative to the other button. If I move the top button down, then the other button will move with it. And this is reflected in the text because in the original button, you can see it's aligned to the left of the parent, whereas this one is aligned to the left of button 2. And of course, you can update the attributes of your elements directly here. So if we wanted a full width button, we could just change the width to match parent, and we'll get a nice full width button there. Okay, so there's a lot of things you can do here, a lot of ways that you can lay things out. It's very, very flexible. I'm just going to show you one nice trick which we'll use later in the course, and that is if you want two items next to each other centered on the screen, that can be a slightly tricky thing to work out. In fact, if you want to give it a try, pause the video and try and have two buttons positioned next to each other so that they're both centered together on the screen. Give it a go. Did you manage it? It's probably trickier than you thought it might be. But a nice way to do it is to use this linear layout here, which simply lays things out from left to right. So let's just get rid of our existing buttons and then bring in a horizontal linear layout. We'll center it for now. We're going to change the size in a minute. And then let's bring in our buttons and put them inside the linear layout. So there's one. You can see it's stretched to full width there. But if we squeeze in another one, then within the horizontal linear layout, it will always lay them out from left to right. So if we want those to be centered on the screen, we can take our linear layout and change the width. Instead of being full width, we'll change it to wrap the content. So it's just the width of the buttons. And we'll also change the height to wrap content as well. And now we've got a centered, it's actually centered horizontally and vertically, linear layout containing two buttons, which might be something like a cancel button and an OK button, something like that. It's a very common use case for two buttons next to each other. So using sub-layouts like that can be a very useful way of positioning objects within your app exactly where you want them. There's a few other layout types, of course, as well. We've got the vertical linear layout, which does exactly the same thing, but vertically. A grid layout, which is the same, but a bit more flexible. And frame and table layouts as well, all of which we'll use at various points later in the course. So feel free to play around with these and try and create a nice layout for your app. But for now, we're going to go back to working with media, and we're going to start with looking at how to create animations in Android.